So now in this waiting time would be the perfect time for people to spot your room, Elisabeth. Hey, Eliana.
Hey there. Sorry, just got out of a call. Hi, Duncan. Good to see you.
Eliana, how nice to see you. How are you?
I'm okay. I won't be able to come to BREAD this year. I'm so sorry. But
Oh, I think lots of people. I'm not going to be able to go either.
no.
You know, it's kind of hard to switch to the let's all travel around the globe all over again for things like a conference, given all the other demands on our time right now.
No, I've actually been there for 10 days. I just misplanned my flight across the ocean, and now it's become hard to arrange a second one. It's my teaching term, but
Yeah.
it's okay. It's great that we get to see each other at least virtually.
No, it's great. I think this was a fantastic idea, a really fantastic idea, and sort of thing that you think, why did we not think about this before the pandemic? Because it just makes so much sense for a global community, and BREAD, CEPR, it's just great. Well done.
Well,
Okay.
Martina, Karen, Gianmarco, and Giacomo deserve all the credit. It's their idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna take the opportunity now and welcome everyone to our VDEV CEPR BREAD seminar. And today we're very happy to have Duncan Thomas from Duke University to present. And as most of you know by now, the basics are the seminar is for 1 hour. And then in the last 15 minutes, there is a Q&A when you're more than welcome to raise your questions to Duncan. And in the meantime, during the seminar, if you have clarifying questions or questions throughout the talk, write them in the Q&A, and I will stop Duncan at some few spots and pass on the questions if they are clarifying. And if there are questions that can be asked later on, more broad questions, we might wait for them and you can ask them yourselves to Duncan. Yes, very happy, Duncan, to have you present. The floor is yours.
Martina, thank you so much. And everyone who organized this, thank you very much for inviting us. We're delighted to be able to present. And honestly, this is just a fantastic mechanism for us to have a super global community involved in investigation of questions and development. So thank you very, very much. The paper I'm going to talk about is joint with Nick Ingwersen and Elizabeth Frankenberg, who I think are on the call with us. And so they will also be able to answer questions and participate in the Q&A afterwards. The paper we're going to talk about is from a large project that we've been doing for quite some time now on the impact of a major natural disaster, which I'll obviously talk about in detail. And this paper, we're going to focus on the evolution of risk aversion during the immediately after the tsunami, after the natural disaster, and thereafter for 5 years. So the question we want to ask is, how do attitudes towards risk evolve after a large-scale natural disaster? And to answer that question, we're going to use responses to a financial risk question that was a hypothetical set of questions. We're going to compare people who are directly affected by the natural disaster with those who are not directly affected. And we're going to do this over 5 years post-disaster using panel data. The natural disaster is the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. It was devastating. It caused severe damage across a large swath of the northern part of the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, and in some areas were completely destroyed by the tsunami. So at 8 o'clock in the morning on Boxing Day, that is December 26 in 2004, the Sumatra Andaman earthquake registered 9.3 on the Richter scale, which at the time was the largest reading in recorded history. It shifted the North Pole by several centimeters and caused a tsunami that was felt right across the Indian Ocean. So you can see the purple is the height of the waves, darker purple is darker waves, and the tsunami, the brown in this area is areas that are thought to be damaged. It's a rather crass measure of damage, but you can see that right across the Indian Ocean, the tsunami hit the coastline, even reaching Africa. However, the epicenter was right at the edge of the red box I put in there, and at the tip of the island of Sumatra, which is this island along here, is the province of Aceh, and then south of that is the province of Sumatra. And as you can see, the claim is that all of Aceh was damaged by a tsunami, and that's an overstatement, but definitely Aceh was hardest hit. And both the north and west of the island of Sumatra, Indonesia, was the area that took the biggest hit from the tsunami. And the reason, of course, is that the epicenter was about 150 kilometers off the coast of Aceh and North Sumatra, the provinces of Aceh and North Sumatra. And it caused a tsunami surge that was at least 800 kilometers per hour in an area that was not thought to be prone to tsunami. So about 20 minutes after the earthquake, there was this major tsunami that hit the coastline of Aceh and North Sumatra. And there had not been a tsunami on mainland Sumatra for over 600 years, and that's based on, for about 600 years, and that's based on archaeological evidence. There was no expectation of a tsunami in the Indian Ocean, so they weren't even what Americans call buoys and what English speakers call buoys. There were no buoys in the Indian Ocean at the time. The buoys were in the Atlantic and Pacific, and so there was no early warning system in the Indian Ocean. And indeed, because people didn't know what happened when there was a tsunami, one of the reasons it was devastating is when a tsunami comes along, the water starts receding in anticipation of the major waves. And so people started running down to the beach to collect the fish. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people died. So the important point that I'm trying to make is that this was a large shock. The tsunami was huge, but also it was unanticipated. No one expected a tsunami along the coast of Aceh and North Sumatra. Now, how large was it? Some people living along the coast experienced wave heights that reached 15 meters. The water and the mud that was from the tsunami, the water that was from the tsunami itself, from the waves, and the mud that it took and the debris it took with it, reached up to 6 kilometers inland. And in some places, the coastline was permanently shifted up to 1.5 kilometers. The province of Aceh, on the tip of the island, northern tip of the island of Sumatra, was the hardest hit place in the world. It's estimated that about 170,000 people died. That is 5% of the population of Aceh, the whole population of Aceh. And of course, all the people who died were living in coastal Aceh. Our study will focus on coastal Aceh, and the vast majority of the population does live in coastal Aceh, but it was a very big hit to the mortality in the province. And on top of that, 700,000 people were displaced or moved because of the tsunami. It's estimated, and I think these estimates are very rough, but nonetheless, order of magnitude, estimated that there was about $4.5 billion at the time of property damage. What did it do? It destroyed livelihoods, destroyed buildings, destroyed roads, it destroyed land. Basically, where the tsunami hit, it destroyed the built and natural environment, and where the effects were not as dramatic, it damaged the built and natural environment, and that sort of would give you a range of impacts from complete devastation to maybe not a set of mud or something inundating an area, or saline inundating land. Of course, with the loss of roads and loss of built infrastructure, there was reduced access to food, water, and markets. And in fact, some communities were completely destroyed. This is a photograph after the tsunami. This was a village. The village was totally wiped out. This building here was quite far in, and the coastline has just been completely changed. And that is the worst case scenario. And in some of the communities we worked in, up to 70% of the people died. The tsunami was followed by a massive influx of aid and assistance. For those of you who are old enough to remember it, which is probably not many of you on the call, the tsunami was followed by a major international and domestic aid program. It's estimated that approximately 70.2 billion was directed to recovery in Aceh. And just compare that with the estimated damage. This says that after the tsunami, the built environment, at least, and maybe to some extent the natural environment over time, would be better than it was pre-tsunami. And initially, the reconstruction was focused on food and temporary housing to try to help the people who'd been, their homes had been completely destroyed. And many of the people who were displaced moved to camps. About half moved to camps and about half moved to other private types of housing. Around about 2 years after the tsunami, 2 or 3 years, it sort of varied when it occurred, there was a program that was trying to rebuild the infrastructure. And there were major investments in roads and buildings. This varied both geographically across space. It occurred, more earlier in areas that were easier to access, closer to the capital city, Banda Aceh. And it there were certain aspects of reconstruction that occurred earlier than other aspects. So let me tell you a bit about this reconstruction and the damage. Here is a picture, a satellite image, the type of images that we were using to measure the damage. And this is a village in Aceh, Kuang Kala. This is not a village in our study because, of course, our study villages locations are anonymized for human subjects reasons. So this is any village along the coast. You could pick one that was damaged, and this is the one we picked to illustrate what happened. Kuang Kala, this was the first image on the left there, was taken 5 days before the tsunami. And you can see there's aquaculture here, there's houses along the road here, there's a road along there, and there's more houses along the road here. And there's a fair amount of productive agriculture, both close to these houses and also along here. This image was taken 3 days post-tsunami, and it is exactly the same area. You can see all of the agriculture was completely destroyed. The whole of the land was converted to just brown earth, and all the houses were completely, utterly destroyed. This is devastation. These are the areas where there was very, very high mortality. 5 years later, and this image is a bit dark, I apologize for that, you can see there was an enormous amount of reconstruction. It was not everything that came back. Aquaculture has never come back. The houses are much more sparse than they were before, but sort of located in the same place. But you can see that the road has actually been rebuilt in a different location. And so the post-tsunami landscape offers different opportunities, economic opportunities for people whose economic lives and their assets have been completely destroyed by the tsunami. And that's the sort of change that we will leverage in this study. And the idea behind the program was, President Biden of the United States has picked up the same terminology, but the Indonesians and the president declared it as a program to build back better. And the idea was that post-tsunami Aceh would be better and would be able to withstand these kinds of disasters than it did pre-tsunami. And this is, I think, the largest reconstruction effort in a developing country to date, and certainly one of the most successful, if not the most successful. So there's 3 key points of this context that I want to emphasize. First, it was a large and unanticipated shock. Second, it destroyed livelihoods and assets. And third, it was followed sometime 2 or later years after the tsunami by a major reconstruction program that was very successful. So what do we know from theory and from the literature about attitudes to financial risk in the aftermath of a tsunami or natural disaster? Well, first, if there's a loss of assets, expected utility theory would say that, or would predict that if we maximize expected utility with convex preferences, lower wealth means that we're going to be wanting to be more risk averse. However, on the other hand, prospect theory would suggest that if pre-tsunami wealth was a reference point of your wealth, and you've had a decline in wealth, you may be willing to take on more risk in order to get your wealth back to where it was before. So that would mean that post-tsunami, there would be a reduction in risk aversion. And so honestly, the theory is unclear, and it could be either more or less risk aversion post-tsunami. And indeed, the prospect theory and possibly even expected utility maximization suggests that these shifts in risk aversion may well be temporary. As you rebuild your wealth, you may go back to being less risk averse if you maximizing expected utility, or maybe more risk averse if prospect theory is correct. And so it's important to think about theory being not clear and also suggesting maybe there's a temporary effect. The second possible mechanism that is in the literature and is that with a change in economic opportunities in livelihoods, it's possible that risk attitudes towards risk will change. So there are at least two major sources of changes in that attitude in the livelihoods of our respondents. The first change is that when the seawater inundated land, the land was salinated, and rice, which is the major crop in Aceh and North Sumatra, major arable crop, does not grow at all well in salinated land. So the land was no longer suitable for rice. So either you had to switch out of agriculture, or you would have to switch to a different crop. That would require taking on risk that really you hadn't been taking on for years if you'd been cropping rice in your paddy for many years. In addition, with the Reconstruction program, there were new work opportunities, and an obvious one would be reconstruction of roads and buildings. And again, people who had not been working in construction would now be have opportunities for pretty well-paying jobs that may require some mobility and certainly would have a role of uncertainty. In addition, with all the construction that came in, there were new workers coming in from other parts. And so not only would men have opportunities for construction, but also women would have opportunities for doing things like selling food that the construction workers would now buy when they were on the site. And so there were new opportunities around the Reconstruction program for men and for women that would involve the potential for having to take on risk that you had not previously taken on in order to exploit those new opportunities. And again, once you've got used to being a construction worker or used to growing some other crop rather than rice, that may also result in your attitudes towards risk changing. So it's possible that that would be a temporary effect as well. And then this experience of disaster is sort of not totally clear what that literature predicts. So on one side, you're faced with a disaster, you experience disaster. Some literature suggests you'll be more cautious. On experiments in psychology, which are not long-term or anything like that, do suggest that at least with animal models, there's an adoption of more risky behaviors after trauma. And there's some suggestion that might be true among humans as well. But I think this literature is not completely clear about the prediction. And so you may be more or less risk averse. And so the whole point of this is that this is clearly an empirical question, and we really don't have a strong theory for what we should be, what we predict. Okay, so let me turn to the data. The data we're using is a study we called the Study of the Tsunami Aftermath and Recovery. And if nothing else, we came up with a good acronym, STAR. Basically, the baseline for our study is actually a study that's is a survey conducted by Statistics Indonesia. Stats Indonesia conducts Tsunami. It's a super well-known survey. Lots and lots of people have used it. It's well-known in the development literature. It's a nationally representative socioeconomic survey. It's conducted now twice a year. At that time, it was conducted once a year. So February, March 2004, which recall the tsunami was December 26, 2004. So this is 9 to 10 months before the tsunami. Tsunami interviewed about 40,000 respondents along the coast of Aceh and North Sumatra, Sumatra Utara. And the key for our point of view, for our study, is that Tsunami is designed to be population representative at the district level. District in Indonesia is a kabupaten. So the kabupaten level is population representative. And what we did was selected every kabupaten that had a coast, that was along the coast, that had a coastline in Aceh and on the west coast of the province of North Sumatra. So we have a pre-tsunami sample that includes every area that was at risk of being impacted by the tsunami. And it does include areas that were directly affected by the tsunami, and others that were left at least directly untouched. That serves as our baseline for STAR. And we collaborated with Stats Indonesia on the first follow-up, in which we tried to find all the baseline respondents post-tsunami. And the first follow-up started 5 months after the tsunami in May 2005. And well, it was really hard field work. And it's about 450 communities spread across the entire coastline of Aceh and the west coast of North Sumatra. And it took us over a year to do the first round. The field work was really, really, really tough, as you can well imagine, especially because we had no idea at the time. We didn't have satellite imagery at the time. So the first indicator we would have that an area was damaged was when our interviewers got to the area and they were trying to find the community. And in some cases, the community was completely intact, and that was great. We could interview those people, but in other cases, the community had been really devastated, and everyone had moved either to temporary housing or to private housing. Fortunately, because we got into the field very quickly, i.e. within 5 months of the tsunami, quite a few of the camps did not open right away. And so quite a few people were still living in the area that was very damaged and were living in tents. And that meant that we were able to find at least some of the people who were living there before the tsunami. And that then gave us the basis to then go and try and find the other people who had by then moved on. We did the first follow-up the year after the tsunami. We did 6 more follow-ups. And obviously a big question in this kind of context is, did we actually find the respondents? So approximately 5% of our respondents, actually approximately 7% of our respondents died. And we are very confident of identifying those who died because we used multiple measures to identify death, not just, someone told us this person died, so we marked them off as not survived. We actually use at least 3 indicators: a family member, a person who lived in the community nearby that family member, i.e. was part of the survey in the enumeration area, or a community informant. Those were the 3 sources of information we would draw on. And we never stopped trying to find people who we thought had not survived, and we carried on confirming that. And we did find a few people who had not who we thought had not survived, and we subsequently found they survived. That would be a handful, something like 20 people altogether. So we're very confident we got survival about right. And if we don't know whether you survived or not, we don't mark you as not survived. We will try to track you forever. We do try to track our respondents all the way through the waves. And we have the most amazing team working with us in Indonesia. The team is led by Cecep Sumantri, and him and the team from Survey Mita have actually found 98% of the survivors at least once post-tsunami. And a study about follow-up would give us another seminar altogether, and be more than happy to talk about follow-up with anyone. Obviously, this is a huge testimony to the quality of the field work. That is not to say, to be clear, we found 98% of survivors every single wave in each of the follow-ups, that we've just found them at least once. And some of them we've only found once or twice because they've been really hard to follow up. So let me be clear about the timeline. We have a pre-tsunami baseline, 10 months before the tsunami. We have the tsunami late 2004, and our first follow-up was May 2005 to June 2006. We then just did permanent field work for 5 years. So 2005-06 was year 1, 267 year 2, and so on, up until year 5 follow-up, which was 2009-10. At that point, we saw some stability, and we decided to switch to 5-year follow-ups, and we've done a 2013, 14, 10-year follow-up. And then 2019, we started the 15-year follow-up. And with COVID, well, that's taken us a bit longer. And we're trying to finish up that follow-up. We're hopefully going to finish that one, what we call our 15-year follow-up in 2022. In this project, we're going to use the year 1 follow-up. We don't use a pre-tsunami baseline because this analysis did not include any questions on risk. And so that's a challenge for us. We're going to use the year 2 follow-up, and we'll use the year 5 follow-up. And you'll see why we're doing that in a moment. But those are 3 waves of the panel survey that I'm going to report results on for you. Okay, so here is a map of, yes.
I'm going to ask you a question that Alessandro Tarozzi sent. He's also saying it's great to see you again.
It's great to see you too, Alessandro.
Yeah, and so what Alessandro is wondering is what you're documenting changes in deep parameters, so preferences due to the events, or is it changes in risk-taking behavior for kind of keeping constant deep parameters driven by changes in constraints, or is it a bit of both?
So I will show you exactly what we're doing in about 2, 3, 4 slides. And what we're trying to do is measure we're trying to measure attitudes towards financial risk with hypothetical questions. So it's actual questions to hypothetical choices of different income streams, and not whether or not they took on risky behaviors. I will show you that we predict risky behaviors with these. So we think the risky behaviors are what we think of as maybe risky behaviors. So we think they're correlated, but we're not going to say who took on different types of risk-related behaviors, because that is much more complicated to identify. We think that's much more complicated to identify, and but I'll show you some results from that, and we'll see if that speaks to if that answers your question, Alessandro. If not, happy to carry on with more discussion. Let me show you how we're measuring the risk. Our goal here is to look at underlying preference parameters, at least some indicators of those sorts of parameters. So, okay.
Yeah, so one more question just
Martina.
while you were talking about the sample, really.
Yep,
so this is from Shuai Shen. So what is the proportion of residents who were relocated? So for these then domestic migrants, how do you disentangle the change in risk aversion due to relocation versus the risk?
So we re-interviewed 98% of all survivors, including those who moved away, who were displaced immediately after the tsunami, and then those who also came back to the origin location. That picture I showed you, a lot of people went back to in that place, it was Kala. And so we are not separating people who moved versus not moved. We don't think that people who moved away, were displaced, would be more or less they didn't do that because of more or less risk. There's little evidence that moving immediately after tsunami was related to their attitudes towards risk. What it was related to was, how damaged was your community. People moved from the damaged communities, and then the people who moved to camps tended to be much poorer than the people who moved to private homes. And in our study here, when we have 98% of survivors, since approximately 40% of people have actually moved post-tsunami, that is 98% of everyone, including that 40%. And so the study we've got here includes these people who are displaced. Is that clear?
Yes.
Great. And we're not going to separate those out because those are not choices that's sort of endogenous. We don't want to take that into account in this sort of framework. But we certainly could, and we could tell you how those play out. And it's an interesting aspect of what we're doing. So let me show you the study sites. Each of these dots here is one of our communities. Red is supposed to marks places that were very heavily damaged. And then the blue would be our comparison areas where there was what we'll say no direct damage. There was some damage, but not heavily damaged. And you can see right here was the epicenter. And the key point here is that it's not that because you were close to the epicenter, there was damage. It's going to be a function of other factors rather than just how close you were to the epicenter. So let me scale this up so you can see, because underlying these the red dots are on top of the blue dots. Underlying the red dots, there's a whole lot of blue dots, and you just can't see them. So this is one of the areas. This is a C, and this is one, we call it a subdistrict, Kecamatan. This is one area. This is very small, and I'm going to, the red dots are these, sorry, they were red before, now I've made them black. These black dots were the red dots that were heavily damaged, and these other dots were areas we're going to call not directly affected. And the key point here is we're going to compare people who are living here with people who are living here and also here, but they're living in the same Kecamatan. The heavily damaged areas, what's important is that it depends on the topography of the land and sea floor. As you can see from here, it's not just the epicenter, it's also going to be, and it's not just whether you are inland or not, because these people were all very close to the coast, but these guys got impacted very heavily, and these people who are very nearby were not. And then further in from the coast, you can see this is an area that was fairly flat, whereas here we're seeing there was some elevated topography. So it's a combination of topography of the land and seafloor, the location of the earthquake, and the wave height and wave direction. All of those mattered, and they're pretty much unpredicted, other than perhaps topography, land topography, which we will condition our models. And the idea that I think is the most salient for thinking about what we're trying to compare is that if you think of a promontory, on one side was faced the waves, it was completely devastated. The other side of the promontory, because of a landmass, they were totally protected. That's the sort of experiment we're trying to replicate here. We don't have an RCT, obviously, and there's not going to be an RCT of a tsunami. So we have to use observational data for this. And I should tell you, how do we measure this damage? We measure damage using satellite imagery, high resolution satellite imagery. We took a 3x3 pixel, 3x3 pixels around the center of the numeration area, and that would be 75 meters by 75 meters. And then we counted how many of those 9 pixels switched from being natural built environment that is either green, or you can see buildings or roads or something like that, to just brown earth. And that would be the heavily damaged areas. We just, the land was just scraped away by the tsunami. We also use direct observation to confirm, so that we make sure that where we think there was heavy damage, it was consistent with it, direct observation, because there's cloud cover and all that kind of stuff. And then we validated that using the mortality that we estimate from our survey in each of our communities. And so that sort of triangulation gives us our heavily damaged areas. Now, to Alessandra's question, how do we measure financial risk? What we're using is a very standard hypothetical risk assessment. We ask the respondent to choose between 2 hypothetical income streams. They're going to get this income stream monthly for a year. They're going to either get $40 with certainty every month, or they're going to get, with 50-50 probability, either $80 or $30. Obviously, that has an expected value of 55, which is above the $40, and the respondent will choose between those income streams. We took great pains to not describe this as a gamble. This is a sort of people in the literature will call this a gamble. We didn't, because of course, Indonesia is a Muslim country, and Aceh is an especially is Muslim. Islam is especially important in Aceh. In fact, there is Sharia law is in place in Aceh. So to talk about a gamble would not be a good idea at all. And of course, these amounts are in rupiah. So how much are they? $40 is approximately median monthly per capita household expenditure. So essentially, we're trying to double the resource availability they have to make this a very salient choice. And if someone said, I want $40 with certainty, we'll call them more risk averse. And obviously, if they take the stream with 50-50 probabilities, we'll call them less risk averse. If they chose the uncertain stream, then we offered them a second choice, which had a lower expected value, to see if we could get more evidence of how much risk they're willing to take. And if they once again picked the uncertain stream, we gave them a third choice, so that the expected value was even lower. So the idea was, rather than giving them a whole load of choices, which is a standard Eckel-Grossman approach, we just made it up into binary choices to make it easier for the respondent, that they were just picking between 2 options, and we would just do this adaptively, so that it was simpler for the respondent to deal with. And obviously, the people who picked 80-10, we would think of as the least risk averse, and the people who picked 40 with certainty, we think of as the most risk averse. So we also did some extensive piloting prior to actually STAR. We did this in a different project altogether. And so we knew that there was a concern with this instrument in Indonesia. And so we had added a screener question to the instrument. And our screener question asked the respondent the same, there's monthly income stream, you can get $40 for certain, or there's a stream where you'll get $80 with 50% probability, or $40 per month with 50% probability. Clearly, the uncertain stream dominates the certain stream. And we designed that to address two potential concerns that we were aware of. First, it's possible the respondents don't really understand the question, and it kind of baffled, why would you ever do that? I'll take the $40 because I don't believe you really mean that. And so if they took the $40, we would repeat the question, explain to them that you can only get either 40 or 80, so you'll always be better off with that choice in terms of how much money you have, and confirm the person understood it. And we also wanted to, and then they would have the choice again. And we also wanted to make sure that we could pick up whether these people were gamble averse or had certainty preference, which we knew to be an important concern. And if they picked the 80-40 choice, of course, they just went into the questions I told you about, the adaptive questions I told you about. And if they chose the 40 choice, we asked them, would you like to switch? And we explained to them, yeah, as I said, you can't do any worse. You're going to get at least 40 in the other one. Would you like to switch? And that if they said no, we'll call that screened out. We'll say they're people who either gamble averse, certainty preference, or possibly didn't understand, although we don't think they didn't understand it. We don't see any relationship between this and education. And so we call those screened out, and the other guys just carried on and answered all the questions. And so obviously we have the people we think of as least risk averse, the most risk averse, and these are people who are very averse to uncertainty, screened out, and they would be even yet more risk averse is one way to think about them. So what were the responses in the first year post-tsunami? We had 53% who screened out. Of those, 50% stayed screened out and 3% switched. It was not a lot of switching, and we had 47% who immediately picked this choice. And so you can see that we have about 7% who we think of as being least risk averse, and then we're coming along here, 29%, even though they clearly understood the question, they still didn't want to take any risk, and so that would be our more risk averse going to the left. And to repeat that, we have least risk averse going up to the screened out in year one, and these are the people who, willing to take on most risk down here. And we have about 9,860 panel respondents who we interviewed in wave 1, 2, and 5. And these are males and females who are aged 15 above. And you can see that the risk preferences are not the same over time, and that there's not too much on the least risk averse, but there's more people being screened out, and they're being picked up in part by this most risk averse group, and then the next most risk averse. So there's definitely shift, and you can see immediately that that seems important.
Well, Duncan, I'm going to stop you and ask two questions that might be important for later on when you're going to discuss the results of it. So the first one is from Kate Orkin, and she's saying, do the measure that you use of damage capture damage equally well for built-up areas and, for example, agriculture areas? And, might damage, for example, correlate with prior levels of development of these areas?
Kate, Kate, that's a great question. We're going to use 3 measures of damage. I'll explain those in a couple of minutes, and I'm going to speed up. And I'll show you, and I'll try to make the case that this is not just picking up pre-existing differences in wealth. That's super, super important, and that's key for identification.
Okay, and then Philip, I'm going to ask 3 questions. One that is on risk preferences as well. So Philip Curler asks, do you sort out villages that could possibly not have been affected in the control group? So those that are above a certain elevation level, for example, and where tsunami might not have been able to hit. While at the same time, then risk preferences might correlate with such location specifics as well.
Correct, and we're going to try and address that directly.
Okay, and then Alessandro, just on the risk preferences response. So the answers to these questions that people take may change over time because preferences changed or because constraints changed. So in particular, baseline wealth in this case changed, or because both preferences and constraints change.
We totally agree.
The results are interesting anyway, but it seems to be interesting to understand what
we totally agree, and we have not tried to untangle those two pieces. There's no question. It's pretty hard for us with what we know to really pick up the two different pieces, and so that's exactly right. And they get bundled up in our answers. Okay. So let me first address Alessandra's earlier question, which was, are we looking at behaviors or these kind of risk attitudes that are more intrinsic? So do risk attitudes that are more intrinsic predict risky type behaviors? So did people start a business? Well, what we see is, yes, this is linear probability model. So least risk averse were 5% more likely to start a business in the year after the tsunami. They were more likely to buy assets for the business, and they're more likely to take out a loan for a business. And the most risk averse were not. And so there's definitely a correlation here. And we're going to focus on those questions to that long instrument, the instrument that I went through for a long time. Let me get to Kate's question, our exposure to the tsunami. This is one place where I think we have enormous strength. I told you about heavily damaged communities. This is, enumeration area at the time of the tsunami, enumeration of residents at the time of the tsunami. We measure that from baseline, of course, and that this is based on these high resolution satellite images, and 18% of our communities were heavily damaged. We also have individuals who were physically exposed to the tsunami, and that would be both within the heavily damaged areas and in the control areas. This is based on individual specific interviews that were conducted with the respondent in the year after tsunami. The 85% of people in the heavy damaged areas were either caught up in the water, saw the water, heard the water, or heard shouting. And even in the not directly affected 40%, mostly they heard the shouting because it was so loud. So that would be our second measure. And our third measure and that's measured immediately after tsunami. And then our third measure is a measure of loss of household assets. So basically every household had assets pre-tsunami, so it's not a condition on assets, but because wealth is varying, we just use whether they owned an asset. So we're going to have 3 indicator variables here. And we're going to ask whether their assets were damaged or destroyed. And you can see that a third lost assets. Some of this was because of the earthquake. In the heavily damaged areas, 80% lost assets, and in the control areas, 27%. And so we'll use all 3 of these markers, and we'll use indicator variables for the 3 of them independently and then jointly in the empirical model. So what is empirical model? Super simple. We're going to have a respondent choice and risk assessment. It'll be a ordered logit. Higher number means more risk aversion. We'll use these 3 indicators of exposure, 3 dummy variables, the community level damage area, the individual level physical exposure, and the asset loss. And then we will condition on pre-tsunami characteristics to sweep out things like wealth, and we're going to use per capita expenditure for that, since we don't know wealth from the Tsunami survey, gender, birth, cohort, education. We'll also include community characteristics, elevation, distance to coast, whether it's an urban area, so that should address some of those differences. And in addition, we will only compare communities that were in the same subdistrict, which is this sort of idea of this picture here. And so these are really close together. This is a small area, and we're going to be trying to compare these people who otherwise would look identical, and they do. And then the key assumption, as you've identified, is that exposure is exogenous, conditional on these covariates. So we have to believe that we've picked up the those factors that would be correlated in epsilon that be correlated with exposure. And we're going to report odds ratios. So if they're greater than 1, these people are more risk averse. And what are our results? Well, here's the first result using the indicator variable for community being heavily damaged. And you can see that these people are more risk loving immediately after tsunami. In the year after tsunami, they're willing to take on more risk. That's also true if we use the physical exposure measure. And it's also true if we use the household asset loss. And so, they're 36% more likely, in an odds ratio, more willing to take on risk and so on, with community up to 15% with the asset loss. When we include all 3, the coefficients don't really change, but there is correlation among them, and particularly our asset loss is no longer significant. So we don't want to overstate that. The individual and community effects are very robust and seem to be clearly indicating one direction, more willing to take on risk. So to address the question, are is this experiment really an experiment? We ask, are they exposed, and people we call not exposed in this domain, these three markers of exposure, statistically exchangeable? The way we've done that is we took pre-tsunami characteristics and we asked, can we predict whether you're in a heavily damaged community, whether you're an individual was physically exposed, and whether you had asset loss? And we used our covariates, male age, education, log PC, pre-tsunami, urban pre-tsunami, conditional on distance to coast, elevation, and Kachamtan fixed effects, all of which do predict whether you were damaged, of course, and none of these do. These are all p-values, none of them is close to 5%. And if we use all, when we test for all covariates, none of them is predictive. So the idea that the people higher up were wealthier or less wealthy or something, it just isn't driven, it's just not consistent with this, at least if we condition on Kachamtan fixed effects. If we don't condition on Kachamtan fixed effects, this test fails, and that's why we made sure that we include Kachamtan fixed effects through the analysis. Let me speak to robustness of the results a little quickly. Since I've given you these baseline results, we also, the risk aversion, here we're saying that if you screened out, you were the most risk averse. We combine the screened out with the most risk averse, changes absolutely nothing. We are a bit worried about mortality selection, with so many people who died. In our heavily damaged areas, 35% of the people, that's a lie. The heavily damaged areas, 25% of people died on average. And so we control tsunami mortality, that's not driving it. And what if we only look at the heavily damaged areas and we only look at people who got physically exposed? Now, this is a small area. And so you really are talking about people who are very, very close, but some people were physically exposed because of where they were at 8 o'clock in the morning on Boxing Day in 2004. And other people were not because maybe they were on the field, in the field or something like that. And you see, actually, there's absolutely no difference whatsoever. So we conclude that our results are really quite robust. Now, the punchline: what happened to the evolution of risk attitudes? Here's the first year result again, to remind you, these people were willing to take on more risk in the face of all this uncertainty. 2 years on, a year after that, they weren't at all. They've gone back to being just the same as the people who were exposed. And that's true in year 3, and year 4, and year 5, year 10, and year 15. And since it'll be really boring to show you all of those, we're showing you years 1, 2, and 5. And you can see that what happened was that these people took on more risk at the time in the immediate aftermath of this, were willing to take on more risk in the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, but that difference between those who were exposed and not exposed completely disappeared in year 2 and year 5. Now, I cannot tell you that this is because they all went back to pre-baseline, because we don't have pre-baseline. And it's quite possible that in year 2, the people who were not exposed were willing to take on more risk as well. We can't really rule that out because that's just a time effect. But we can say that there was no difference between these two groups. Now, this is based on a panel of people that we interview in all 3 ways. You could say, well, you didn't interview, the panel is selected maybe on mobility and so on. So I'm going to go to the other extreme. We also interview, in our survey, we interview everyone in the household. So I'm going to include not just people who were at baseline, but everybody. We know where they were at the tsunami, everyone in the household in each of the waves. So these are not balanced at all, but many of them the same people. And what do we get in terms of results? Results are actually imperceptibly different. And so we conclude that the panel sample is not somehow selected or different, and that the main result, willing to take on more risk in the year after tsunami and not thereafter relative to not exposed, holds true in all of these samples. And then let me show you a couple of differences which are, I think, informative about what might be going on by looking at some of the heterogeneity. So let's start with age at tsunami. This is the same model, and I'm only going to do first year post-tsunami because there's absolutely nothing going on in year 2 and year 5. In the year after the tsunami, overall, everyone was overall willing to take on more risk if they were heavily damaged or individually exposed. That effect is for individually exposed is true for everyone. Doesn't matter what age you are, they're all going to take on more risk. In the heavily damaged areas, however, this is youngsters who were willing to take on more risk. Presumably, this reflects something to do with new opportunities rather than a lot of lost wealth, because they probably didn't have as much wealth as the older adults. In addition, again, if we stratify by education, everybody right across the board is taking on more risk if they were individually exposed. But in the heavily damaged areas, it is the better educated. So that's possibly because they also have more wealth and that they're responding to the lower wealth and prospect approach, or because they're more able to exploit the new opportunities. And those would not be opportunities in construction, presumably. And so that suggests that there's, we can't really conclude from those what's really going on. And then the third one is household PCE, which is our best measure. This is pre-tsunami, our best measure of wealth or resources pre-tsunami. And that's really interesting because, again, they're the better educated, higher wealth in the communities that were heavily damaged. They're going to exploit the new opportunities. But even the people who had low pre-tsunami wealth, if they were individually exposed, they're really going to go after the new opportunities. So we conclude here that these estimates are really robust. They're true right across the board. There's no difference by gender or any of the other things we've stratified on. And that the damaged areas where people were taking on new risks tended to be among the better off, the better educated, and the younger. And that has powerful implications for both what should you do in the aftermath of a large-scale natural disaster in terms of bringing on resources to help people to maybe build a business, to maybe take on new opportunities, and also who's going to benefit from those. And that sort of speaks a lot to things like, the disaster of COVID and who exploited the new opportunities that came with COVID. And so let me summarize and be finished a little early so we've got time for some more questions and then go to the Q&A. And so we have basically three main results. The context is important. The tsunami was a large and unanticipated shock. It destroyed livelihoods and wealth, and it was followed by new opportunities in reconstruction. We have an identification strategy that exploits the unanticipated nature and the fact that we're able to compare people who were living very close to each other. If they were individually physically exposed, they really are living within the same neighborhood. An enumeration area is an area of 16 households, and the sampling design is you go to a specific location in the village or the neighborhood, you go to the first household that is designated a particular way, and you skip 2 households and go to household 3, skip 2, go to household 6 and 9 down a road, and then you carry on going down a pre-specified path. And so these people are very, very close together. And so the idea there is that conditional on the covariates we've measured, these people are exchangeable. The people who exposed and not exposed are exchangeable. And if you believe that, under the assumptions of that empirical approach, then we're seeing increased willingness to take on risk among the exposed. We see that both for individual level exposures and for our community exposure, and possibly if assets are lost. There was also important, the third point is that increase was transitory. By the second year and thereafter, there was no change at all, and that the exposed and not exposed have not significant differences in their willingness to take on risk, nor are they more or less likely to start new businesses after that in year 2 and so on. There's really no differences there at all. And so the effect is very short-lived and is sort of consistent with the part of the theory that says either you're going to wait till your wealth has gone back up, or you're going to respond to this on it for as a temporary set of opportunities. That part of the theory seems to be borne out by these data. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Very interesting. What a massive amount of data collection, and over time, very impressive and important to study these areas over time. So we have opened up the floor for questions. There's some questions asked in the chat that we would suggest that you raise your hand and ask live. It's more fun for Duncan to hear your voice than just mine. So we're gonna start with the first question, and that's from Katsushi Mai, and I'm now, I think you should be able to talk now.
Thank you very much. This is extremely interesting. I have a question regarding that effect is temporary, restricted to the first year. And how do you see the interaction between the foreign aid or the recovery in terms of infrastructure building and the risk aversion? So do you say that sort of aid will be directly or indirectly influencing the risk aversion? Thank you.
So that's a really good question, and I should ask Elizabeth and Nick to jump in and answer questions. So most of the aid that went to families really only started maybe 3-4 years after the tsunami. The first set of aid programs were really trying to rebuild the roads, rebuild major buildings, the mosques, the community buildings, some of them, the sort of larger businesses and so on. And so the aid that came in to help families, the biggest part of that aid was to help them with the houses. That started coming in year 3, year 4, year 5. And so I think that it's unlikely that our year 2 effects are driven by that aid. However, and there wasn't a lot of financial aid that was anything other than temporary food support and stuff like that. However, it was clear that aid was coming. So it's quite possible that the expectation of aid really affected these people, and they knew that their houses would be, either rebuilt or they would get some help with reparation. One of the things that's quite interesting and which would not suggest it's aid, is that the people who got the most aid in terms of housing were the people who were the poorest and were in the worst housing. Because the housing aid was basically everyone got the same. It was a very standard house. And if you had a pretty nice house and it was rebuilt, the house was going to be rebuilt, you didn't want this standard house. And so the better off people just didn't get as much aid. So since we're seeing that the people who were most responsive, and then everyone came back again, that suggests again that this was not even the expectation of housing aid, because they didn't get very much of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
And now I'm going to open up for Anna Reuter to ask her question.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much from my side too. I've been to the region myself, and I find this a very, very interesting topic. I was wondering a bit about whether your data also allows you to have a look at any heterogeneities by conflict, because there has been conflict in the region before the tsunami. And then after the tsunami, also because of the tsunami, there was an official end to conflict. So I wondered whether your data allows you to have a look at that. Thank you.
I know that's a great question. So it's true that there was a free Aceh movement, GAM, that was trying to devolve so that Aceh would devolve from the rest of Indonesia. And that conflict had been going on for years and years and years. The conflict was, there were peace negotiations started around about, if I recall, March 2005, and by July 2005, there was a signed agreement, and the conflict really disappeared by the had sort of disappeared. The people had laid down their arms. Both sides in the conflict had laid down their arms because of the horror of the tsunami. The important thing from our perspective is that the conflict was largely concentrated in the mountains, which is not where the tsunami hit. And the one part of the area of Aceh that was affected by the conflict and the tsunami is on the northwest coast of Aceh. And that was the area we went to last because the conflict had was still in play when we were trying to do field work. And so by the time we got there, the conflict had really been resolved. So we really are not in a place to say much about the role of the conflict. And frankly, that's a good thing, because you can imagine that the Sosanas survey in areas that were really steeped in the conflict were probably perhaps not as representative as you might like. And so we've not been very successful. A student with us has worked on the conflict, and we've not been very successful at seeing a ton of effects. There's some modest effects using the area that we know was conflict affected, but they're pretty small and quite fragile, I think would be a fair statement. So he has a paper on that, and it's not been, we've not seen a ton of stuff there. I think we're just not we just don't have that sort of information in the area that it was hit by the tsunami.
Thank you. And I'm now going to open up for Philip Curler to ask your question live.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I was, of course, reminded about a paper in the American Economic Journal Applied Economics in 2018 that is by 3 Japanese authors, I presume Hanaoka, Shigeoka, and Watanabe. And they investigate the effect of the Great East Japan earthquake on risk preferences, and they show some tentative evidence that there's a gender heterogeneity in the persistence of preference change. Did you look at any heterogeneity by gender?
We did. And the reason I didn't show it was because I didn't want to have too many tables or too tiny tables. There's absolutely no difference by gender in our setting. Now, I think one of the things that's important is that people really lost huge amounts of resources. And we saw both with the financial crisis in '98 and also with the tsunami that people, the vast majority of men were working before the tsunami, before the financial crisis. But after the tsunami and after the financial crisis, there were a lot of women who went into the labor market who had not previously been working and were doing anything they could to shore up family income, mostly producing food, sometimes producing clothes or stuff like that, but a lot of home production. And we saw a lot of that in the tsunami. And I think that may be what's going on. These women were embracing the new opportunities, and we were asking them, are you willing to, dive in when there's a lot of uncertainty? And they were. And I think that might be what's driving our results. Whereas in Japan, I think there was a lot of social safety nets for people.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And then Robin has a question.
So I guess, well, I don't know if you can get at this, but it strikes me that the advantage of your design is you've got people very proximate to one another, some of whom get a big shock, catastrophic shock, and some don't. And I just, in terms of sort of climate migration, which people are talking a lot about, was there anything that showed up in terms of, and perhaps this wasn't measured, about differential either migration, observed migration, or people wanting their kids to do something different than farming along some coast? Because it strikes me that that's the beauty of the design. There's a bunch of people doing similar things. I don't know if you could look at that, but I've been hearing a lot of people talking about this, and it strikes me this to be an ideal place to see whether people learn from an event like this.
Robin, you're a gentleman and a scholar. That's a great question. And I should have highlighted, how this speaks to the entire, climate questions, because although it's not driven by climate, the inundation of seawater is exactly what climate change is doing. And so we think that we can say something about that. And of course, as you know well, knowing us, our attitude is we will not stop when we ask you questions. So we have actually got quite a lot of information on migration. And that's one of the reasons we did the 5 years annually, because we didn't want to just rely on retrospectives. We have done some work on migration. It is super interesting. There is a big impact of exposure on migration, as you might expect. And then we've been doing some more work on remigration back to these areas or to other areas. So that absolutely you're right. And that's we've written that up, and we have some stuff that's published and some not published, and it needs to be pushed forward. Super great question. And then I think the question about the kids is fantastic. And this is sort of, one of the reasons why we think, it's a royal pain to go back on these surveys and go back and go back and go back. The people do not love you when they see you coming back, but we've got such fantastic interviewers, they totally understand why we're doing this. And the first thing we've done, we've been doing some stuff on the kids and how they've done in the labor market. We've also done a bunch of stuff on their expectations for their education. So we've seen what happened to education, we've seen what happened to labor market outcomes, but we really want to do the young kids. And we're doing some work right now on their expectations for education when they were young, when, in the face of this disaster, how did they evolve? And did that then predict the ultimate education? And so we really do want to see what happened to human capital outcomes, what happened to economic outcomes. And just so that, there's no surprises for anyone, we're also trying to track through the health effects. So one of the things in health that is very widely believed is that if you have a big stressor, you're going to have bad cardiovascular outcomes later on. And the problem with your terrible stressor is that, for us as economists at least, is that a lot of the stressors are not ones that we would think of as being randomly assigned. And so it's not clear whether people who have terrible stressors have bad cardiovascular outcomes because of what drove the stressor or because of the stressor. Well, here we actually have this terrible stressor, and we're following cardiovascular outcomes and other outcomes, and it's really shocking. We do see elevated risks that persist right on for 10 years, 15 years beyond. And we even see some later cognitive outcomes that are related to stress. So it's sort of, these things definitely leave their fingerprint on adults. And interestingly, one result we have, which is super, super, super surprising, is that we looked at in utero effects, those people were exposed, and we find there was a large negative impact on the kids in utero for 3 or 4 years. And by 5 years, they had made it all up again. So there's definitely a lot of resilience, but there's resilience in dimensions that are very observable, child height, but maybe not in dimensions that are very difficult to observe, like inflammation, which is your best predictor of cardiovascular disease. So it's sort of, it's super interesting, and it's great.
Thanks a lot.
And next question is by Kate Orkin, and you are now unmuted.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting to see this, and the data collection must have been really, really tough, big effort to do. I was really interested in the correlations between risk aversion and behavior. And it seemed particularly that the thing you were looking at was kind of entry into non-farm enterprise, so portfolio choice. And I was quite interested as to whether the correlation that you saw between risk aversion and starting a business was similar was it there before the crisis as well, and was it similar before and after the crisis, and then because I guess it seemed as though both people's risk preferences might change, but also the extent to which different activities were risky might change. So you might have thought that non-farm enterprises, I'm not sure whether it was more risky before or after the crisis, but it was just an interesting kind of set of things to think through, and in the context of that literature in agriculture, as well as the sort of stuff in behavioral.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. So the direct answer to your question on did we look at it pre-tsunami is no. And the simple reason is because those questions are not included in SUSNAS. So SUSNAS is a fantastic survey, but it's very broad purpose and doesn't have a ton of in-depth types of questions. So we don't actually know, even for example, what self-employment income was if they had their own business in the SUSNAS. So we can't really, the questions that we asked about, did you take on these new activities, were all ones we designed in the follow-up. Our interpretation, I agree with you that it's not clear how risky they might have been perceived as being. We also think it's not clear how they might have been perceived as risky, but they might have also been perceived as very high expected value because, you know, there wasn't relative to, say, trying to keep your rice paddy going. It might have been a really good idea to go and be a construction worker. So it sort of changed, the entire environment changed. And that's a sense in which, as I said earlier in response to Alessandro, we don't think we can distinguish those two mechanisms. And all we were trying to do in look at whether our risk assessment, if you like, those questions, our adaptive assessment, whether they predicted this sort of idea of taking on new types of activities, which usually you would think of as being more uncertainty or more uncertainty or more risk related. And that was all we were trying to get at. Your question is very well taken, and we wish we could answer it. It's you know, the fantastic part of our working with Susanas or Statistics Indonesia is that we actually had a pre-tsunami baseline, and our study is population representative, and then. But of course, you know, we're limited on what, we didn't design that survey, and it wasn't something, you know, we didn't think there was going to be a tsunami. And so we're limited in what questions they include for, you know, they have a government survey. It looks like CPS and CEX in a way.
I'm going to ask a question, and then I'm going to ask, then Giacomo has a question as well. So my question is related to the measure of risk preferences. So I've done this myself, done it with Eliana, and I've done it in Lesotho as well on our HIV study. So I know that it's a demanding question, as you say, because it takes time to answer this. So if they choose something, you continue. I don't know what the evidence is here when you do this repeated over time. Do they learn? And do they learn that when you take the more kind of risk-loving measure, that it takes time, that you continue and iterate? So, you know, if they're tired of answering this survey, an easy way is to say, I take $40.
So that's a great question and gets into the entire complexity of survey design. Mm-hmm. So there's two things that we can say to speak to that. The first one is that we interview everyone in the household, and so we know if when you answer these questions whether someone else in the household was present. And then we may ask them, you know, whether someone was present, heard you asking these questions, and then, you know, we went and asked them the same questions later. So the learning, they should have known your optimal strategy is to always say no to everything. And we have no evidence of that, you know, being in an individual interview before. Then the second one is we also, when someone's new in the household, they've never been interviewed before, we ask them the whole panoply of questions. We're completely shameless. And that's the idea that as households change, we really want to know how your entire context has changed. And so those people would be the first time they ever got those questions. And so we should see those people saying yes, 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 more than the people who've been asked before. We don't see that either. And then we haven't looked, but we should look, do people who are better educated say no on the second one? And that's a good thing I'd never thought about till you raised it. There's so many things in survey design that, you know, you're just so easy to just fall into if you don't think about it. So that's a fantastic question. So thank you. Yeah, great. We'll definitely add that to the paper, because that's good point to make.
Thank you. And then Jeff has a question.
Hey, Duncan, sorry, very, very quickly, because I think we're running out of time. So I was thinking, like, you know, food and shelter is basically 70% of the budget of a typical household, even more. And so in a way, these people were provided, although at the basic level, food and shelter for the first initial period. That is slightly different mechanism, right? So if you have insurance on the one end, you shift risk, like the other argument, you shift risk somewhere else, which basically means you take more risk on other dimensions. Is that something that could somewhat be part of the story, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. Nick, you may know. So one of the things we could do, so food and shelter, you got shelter by going into one of the barracks. And of the people who moved, 50% went into these barracks and 50% went into private homes. Actually, quite a few stayed in tents because property rights were not great in this area. And so a lot of people, especially older men, stayed in tents in the original location, no matter that it was a completely devastated. But one way we could, and food was not really provided. I mean,
okay, so I thought that
food prices went through the roof everywhere because of supply. And but we can definitely look to see whether people in barracks had completely different behaviors. It's going to be hard to draw a strong conclusion because the people who went to barracks were selected, but that's a good question to ask that. And we may have other ways to look at that. That's a super good question. Yeah, super good question. I mean, basically their PCE collapsed, their real PCE collapsed because it had to run across the board, and that was because of elevated prices. No, that's a great question. A whole ton of fantastic questions. This has been super helpful.
Yes, and an amazing, very interesting discussion, but it is a very impressive paper, Nick, Elizabeth, and Duncan, to collect this data for so many years. A big applaud on that one. Not many people or researchers have the time and energy to do it, but it's important. So thank you so much for a very interesting talk, for a very interesting discussion. And Duncan is available on Zoom. Gianmarco has in the chat, you find his Zoom link. So please join his Zoom room and continue the discussion. And then they're telling me here I should mark it myself. Next VDEV, come and listen to me talk about community health workers in Uganda, long-term results, and a little bit on RCT program adaptation. So see you in 2 weeks.
Martina and everyone, thank you so much. This has been a ton of fun, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you very much, Duncan.
Duncan.
Bye.
Bye-bye.